that's the new law in Canada. Absolutely, just passed last week.
What about Canada?
Well, he was saying the Canadian Prime Minister meets a lot of these characteristics, and he really does. He's elected. Okay, number 2, he will claim to be God and demand to be worshipped. Now, again, many of these things do not happen when the Antichrist appears originally. They happen about midway through the process when he becomes who he really is. He comes across as this suave, sophisticated leader who's going to save the world because, the Christians, as we talked about, have been raptured away. The world's in chaos. He's going to be the great savior. There's the mimicry again, okay? And he's going to look like this really nice guy. Midway through, basically scholars believe that's when he's going to turn, especially on the Jews and on those who have become Christians during the tribulation. Now, this is one that Paul talks about, 2 Thessalonians 2. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not occur until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed. That's Paul's description of the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, the man doomed to destruction. We're going to see that at the end of this list. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worship, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. Remember last week we talked about the question, will the temple be rebuilt? Well, this is one of the verses that lead us to believe that's true. Notice it says he sets himself up in God's temple. Well, he can't set himself up in a temple that doesn't exist. But when he does, he is going to be center stage of the universe and want everybody to bow down to him. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar, remember Nebuchadnezzar and his great statue that he made everyone bow down to. The whole story of the three Hebrews who refused to and cast in the fiery furnace. That's really a recreation, if you will, whole Antichrist thing, because they're going to build a big statue that everybody's going to have to bow down to. That's in the scripture. Okay? Yeah, right. So this is one of those verses that talk about the temple being rebuilt. Okay. Revelation 13:4. People worship the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. So they literally entered into Satan worship because of the way he empowered the Antichrist. And they also worship the beast and ask, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? So you see this constant theme of the Antichrist being worshipped as God expects us to worship him and to worship Christ. Revelation 13:8. All the inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all those whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. So there will be people who refuse. That's the Christians who become Christians during the tribulation. Most scholars believe that's the only way you can be saved during the tribulation. You refuse to worship the beast, you refuse to take the mark of the beast, and you end up being executed. But that's your ticket to heaven, because you will not bow down. Now again, way back in Daniel talks about this. The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. There's the blasphemy again. So Daniel talked about both of those things way back hundreds of years before the time of Christ and Paul. Right? So the Antichrist blasphemes God, then sets himself up to replace God, basically. I mean, if you think about it, we talk about politicians, and I don't think any U.S. politician is going to be the Antichrist, but isn't that exactly what we do politically? We bash the other guy, then we tell you how good we are because we want to replace him.
Most of them are too old.
Yeah, probably. Okay, so that's second. Third thing the Antichrist will do is he will display miraculous powers. Now, think about that. What was the most noteworthy thing that Jesus did during his ministry? Miracle after miracle after miracle. Remember, some months ago we went through that whole long list of his weeks in adult Sunday school class. The Antichrist will display miraculous powers. Again, Paul talks about this. The coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with how Satan works. He will use all sorts of displays of power through signs and wonders that serve the lie, and all the ways that wickedness deceives those who are perishing. perish because they refuse to love the truth and to be saved. So, he's going to perform miracles. And that's the false prophet, it's not listed there. It performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast, who was wounded by the sword, and yet lived. Okay, now here, this ties a couple of these things together. Here's the image coming into play, okay? And that deception again, which is Satan's operating method to deceive people into believing a lie. Right? So, he's going to do miracles. Notice the mimicry. He said the false, or the unholy Trinity mimics the Holy Trinity. Everything we've seen are the mimicry in a false, phony way of the things that Jesus did, that God did. Number 4, this is a powerful one. He will be resurrected just as Jesus was. Now, as Christians, we believe that the ultimate sign of the power of God was the resurrection of Christ. Okay? Jesus raised people from the dead. But what's the difference between the resurrection of Lazarus and the widow of Nain's son and Jesus? What's the difference? There are 2 significant differences. Well, so did they.
He's still around.
Okay, Jesus is still alive. Everybody that Jesus resurrected died again. Okay? That's the first difference. Jesus is still alive. Okay? You were going with really more the second one. The second major difference is nobody else was involved. Jesus spoke and Lazarus came out of the grave. Jesus resurrected his own power and his own will. Okay? Every other resurrection in the Bible was based on God's decision using his prophet or using Jesus to raise somebody from the dead. Jesus came back to his own power and volition. Okay?
I always kind of wondered why people that died and were brought back by Jesus never commented on it.
Yeah.
Or if they did,
You're absolutely right. It's one of those things that, again, I've said this often, but there are certain questions that I really would like to ask. Okay, why don't we have an account in the Bible of Lazarus telling us what happened? Okay, that would be nice to know. I agree. Okay, that's one of those things I like to. I heard a comedian the other day. I maybe mentioned this to some of you, but I heard a comedian the other day, a Christian comedian, and he was talking about, we all talk about the resurrection of Lazarus, and we always talk about it from the perspective of Jesus and Mary and Martha. He said, have you ever heard anybody tell you the story of Lazarus from Lazarus' perspective? And I thought, now that's interesting. But think about it. Lazarus was in heaven. He had entered into eternity. He was never going to have another problem. I don't muddy the water on it. Okay. If you want to find out, somebody actually did tell this story from Lazarus' perspective. If you want a fun take on this, look up Carmen's song, Lazarus Come Forth. Carmen was a very prominent Christian music figure back in the 70s and 80s. He's since died of cancer and is in heaven himself. But Carmen has a great song called Lazarus Come Forth. And it's interesting because his perspective is Lazarus is at this meeting in heaven with Moses and David, all these other great figures. They're all there, and they're talking about, how they experienced God. And Lazarus says, I knew him in a way y'all never did. I walked with him. I talked with him. I was there when he fed the 5,000. I saw the lame walk and the blind see. He said, in fact, I think I hear his voice right now. And then this big booming bass voice, Lazarus, come forth. it's just a really cool song. But think about it from Lazarus' perspective. That's this comedian said, I'm not sure Lazarus was thrilled about the fact that he had to go back. But the Antichrist, again, will resurrect himself in much the same way that Jesus was resurrected. Talk about an act of deception. Notice, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. Okay? It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the inhabitants and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. Now, fatal means dead. That's what it means, okay? The literal translation of fatal wound is slain to death or the blow of death. Now, did I put that website in your notes?
Yes.
Okay, yes, it should be under number 4. This is what, if you want to go back and look at that's the website. I gave it to you so you can type it in, okay? This guy had the most unique perspective on this I have ever seen, all right? I don't know whether he's right or wrong, okay? He's just a blind guy feeling an elephant, just like us. But I was fascinated by what he said. I'm going to share some of what I got off that website, okay? He starts with this verse. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. Notice the timeline. It was, it's not, that's the death part, will come up out of the abyss, that's the resurrection, and then will ultimately go back to destruction. So you see the timeline. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. And if you think about it, how is Jesus described over and over in the book of Revelation? Who was, and is, and will be. There's the exact same formula. The mimicry of the unholy Trinity, of the Holy Trinity. Now, this is his commentary. You're not going to be able to write all this down. That's why I gave you the website. But just listen to this. This is relatively straightforward. If the beast ascends out of the abyss, then he was dead. That's logical. If the beast was and is not and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition, then he was alive on earth, died, went to the abyss, rose from the dead, then dies again, and returns to the abyss. That's exactly what I just told you. Okay? Makes sense. I was reading the wrong page. Okay. Revelation 17, 10 through 11, we read. There are also 7 kings. Now, this is in the book of Revelation. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition. Now, we read that and we go like, what in the world is he talking about? That's what makes Revelation so crazy at times. That's hard to read. But listen to this guy's commentary. This is not advanced calculus understood only by elite mathematicians. This is simple math that anyone can understand. Now, this is where this guy's theory gets very interesting and why I said Caesar Nero was a possibility. Listen to this guy's theory. The Antichrist will be one of the 5 major Roman emperors that lived and died prior to John penning the Revelation in AD 95. The last one of those was Nero. He was in that group. He will rise again from the abyss, live again, and die again. So, how do we reconcile the fact that the Antichrist is both a man who lives and dies in the last days, and a former Roman emperor who lived and died prior to the giving of the Revelation? There is only one solution that harmonizes these two. Shortly prior to the middle of the 70th week, that's the end of the tribulation, okay, the middle, that's the 42, remember we talked about 42 weeks, 42 months. Someone will assassinate the Antichrist. That's the fatal wound that is healed. The dead body will lie in state and then be reanimated. But when this dead man comes back, he will not be himself, but the former Roman emperor raised from the abyss.